If one sees the world through the lens of Scripture, through the lens of the Bible, if one holds what we call a biblical worldview, how would that view of the description of human nature and the purpose and makeup of our societies, how would that view guide someone in terms of how they might approach domestic public policy, fiscal policy, those sorts of things? The primary fundamental element of a biblical worldview that impacts how we would seek to guide domestic or fiscal policy is just the idea that humans are not perfect and humans are not perfectible. None of the institutions, none of the societies or cultures that humans build will be perfect or will be perfectible. And so, because of that, we do not see the role of the government is to change society's knobs, metrics, institutions, laws to bring about this perfection, this possible perfection. Perfection is not possible. And so we think when governments, and we see empirical evidence of this clearly through history, when governments try to tinker and dial toward perfection, they end up making matters worse, not better. And so, again, go to Romans 13, first 7 verses. We see the role of the government is really to protect citizens, in a sense, from one another, from harming one another. That would include protecting citizens from the harm of businesses and other organizations, as well as foreign powers. The government's job is to write and enforce laws that protect people, that protect its citizens from harm and coercion and fraudulent activity, whether it's being done person to person or business to person, etc. And we believe that competition should be fostered by government policy wherever possible because it is a necessary ingredient. We need both. We need competition. We need to be able to vote for our elected officials in a democracy. We need to have multiple choices of where we buy our food so that we know different entrepreneurs are competing for our businesses. If you leave out either one of those 2 points, we believe you come far short of what is possible. Though perfection is not possible, we certainly want to make society the best that we can. So given that foundational biblical worldview, let me hit on 3 points, each with a few subtopics, that would sort of guide domestic policy, guide fiscal policy, if you're looking through the lens of Scripture. And the first is the size of a business isn't what matters. Some industries, some businesses need to be large in order to manufacture cars or planes or ships or trains. There's some scale required in the manufacturing process to do that. So we don't want to get hung up on saying, once a business hits this size, it's too large and it must be restrained or even broken up. What we want to look at is, are there legitimate competitors across the industry? How is market share distributed across those competitors? That's what matters. It's the competition, and it's the breakup, the share of the market each competitor contains, rather than the size. So we would steer away from monopolies, duopolies wherever possible, but absolute size is not necessarily something we're focused on in terms of setting domestic policy. And we don't just believe that competition is valuable for politicians or businesses. So it's not just that we would favor democracy and capitalism. We understand competition will improve all of our human organizations. And so Christians would say there should be competition between schools, public schools, private schools, charter schools, home schools. And Christians tend to back these things. We back voucher programs that allow someone to send their child to a private school, allow someone to send their child to a charter school. We allow individuals to homeschool their children because, again, when we have that competition, the customer, who in this case is the child who's getting an education, though they don't have much voice in the democratic process because they can't vote directly, it gives that child an option. It gives that child's family an option to say, compete for my business. Society will be better off. The individual child, the individual consumer of that education will be better off. And to take that even a step further, what Christians would like to see with unions is competition. So what happens is If an organization, if a workforce at a particular business wants to unionize, there is usually one option. This is the union that's going to unionize that membership. And so it's no coincidence that over the last few decades, as unions have tended to consolidate and increase their power, their leaders have become more visible and more powerful, the membership has continued to decline. And whether it's a monopolistic business, whether it's a single source of education, unions are the same way. If there is only a single option for workers to choose from, society will be less well off. The workers themselves will be less well off. And in this case, more and more workers choose not to join private unions. Now, theoretically, Christians would say unions should be powerful, positive institutions in a capitalist, democratic society. And not just for the workers, but if there were competitive unions, if workers could say, I can either not join a union, or this union, or this union, or this union, and they had a choice between not just yes or no, but no or yes among 3 or 4 competing options, it wouldn't just be the workers who would be better off, but it would be the economy, it would be society. So theoretically, Christians with a biblical worldview absolutely support the idea of private unions and the right of workers to unionize. That's absolutely without question. But as unions began to consolidate and merge together and the leaders grabbed increasing power, people with a biblical worldview would have absolutely predicted that membership in private unions would decline, and we would continue to say, if there's not some form of competition among unions competing for, hey, members, organize under my flag, organize under my association, if there's not some increase in competition among unions for workers, then unions will likely continue to decline in the private sector, again, to the disadvantage of both union workers and the economy at large. Let me just restate to make sure no one misunderstands. We do believe in competition, again, among politicians. It would be great to have it among unions, in education sources, and certainly among businesses. But those with a biblical worldview are not supporting in any way this Wild West version of capitalism where it's no holds barred, no regulation, no anything. Because again, the Bible clearly teaches that God has ordained governments, and one of the roles that God has ordained for governments is the prevention and the punishment when one party commits a crime or engages in some fraudulent activity against another. And so while competition is nice to foster it, you get better products, you get better options, you get lower prices. Government is necessary to regulate businesses the same as it is to regulate individual behavior. So you simply cannot say to someone, hey, I'm sorry that your husband or wife is abusing you, but you chose them freely out of millions of other options. Now go deal with it. We don't say that. We say you freely chose them, but there are laws which they still cannot transgress. And if they are abusing you, we expect the government to step in. If businesses are not fulfilling contracts, violating property laws, if they're manipulating labor in some way, if they're price fixing across other businesses, if there's false advertising, if they're producing externalities, what economists call externalities, if they're polluting our water or our air and not having to pay for it, then we absolutely expect government to step in and enforce those contracts, enforce those property rights, and punish those labor manipulators, price fixers, false advertisers, and externality creators. So we believe in the role of government and in competition. Government shouldn't run the businesses, but they absolutely should enforce the laws that keep businesses from harming, manipulating individuals. And the final thing we would say when it comes to domestic policy is simply this. Because we're not perfectible, our societies, our institutions, our government, our businesses, our schools, our unions are not perfectible. every public policy will have indirect consequences. And what we have to be cognizant of as we both initialize public policy and as we track it over time is whether or not the indirect effects, the unintended consequences of the laws that we pass actually overwhelm the direct positive effects. This is a very real issue and has been historically, and politicians tend to brush it under the rug. One example that I tend to use is after what they called the Great Recession and the financial crisis, the mortgage meltdown, Congress passed what they call the Dodd-Frank laws, the Dodd-Frank regulations. They were really passed to directly prevent another financial crisis of the same description that we had just gone through. The problem was the burdens entailed with those regulations were so onerous, were so complex, that only the largest financial institutions have been able to maintain the staff to comply with those regulations. And the indirect, unintended consequence was far too many smaller banks and financial service organizations were driven out of business. And so that eliminated the competition that the bigger guys face, which is a far more serious issue than anything that Dodd-Frank directly corrects itself. And so we have to be very careful when we put government regulations and public domestic policies in place that we don't favor large businesses and wealthy individuals over small businesses and less wealthy individuals. And that is a massive issue in American public policy today. So our current fiscal policy debates, they tend to focus, I say primarily, but almost exclusively on this heated emotional topic of what should tax rates be across individuals of different income levels and different wealth levels. But here's where someone with a biblical worldview takes a different track. I'm far less concerned with how much of the money you make that you get to keep. Now, it can't be unequal. We can't say that an individual making $10,000 a year has to pay 25% tax, and an individual making $1 million a year only has to pay a 1% tax. But if you say everybody's going to pay 20%, okay, that's far less concerning to someone with a biblical worldview than the idea that those who are wealthy, those who are politically connected, are actually receiving more benefits from the government than the average person, or more benefits from the government than they're paying into the government. And that's always been the case with man-made governments. So it's easy for politicians to say when they're running for office, we need to make that person pay their quote-unquote fair share. We need to make sure that person is paying as much as that person. But again, you made the income, you keep your income, that's fine. But of the taxes that are collected, here's where Christians get concerned. Of the taxes that are collected, how much of it is going back to benefit the wealthy and the politically connected? I can give you numerous examples of this. There is a deduction from the amount of tax that you owe for the interest payments you make on a mortgage. But that's unfair because people who own their homes tend to be wealthier and of higher income than people who rent. Not one for one, but overall the correlation is very, very high. Why are we having those with more wealth and higher income be subsidized for living in bigger and better houses than those who rent? The mortgage interest deduction is wrong. There are subsidies for electric vehicles, thousands and thousands of dollars of subsidies for electric vehicles. And the end result is this. Millionaires are being paid a subsidy by the government to buy cars manufactured by billionaires. If you say, okay, but how much does that millionaire pay in tax to billionaire? Again, that's an issue, but it's far less of an issue. I'm not jealous. I'm not envious. I'm not saying we shouldn't allow anyone to make $1 million. You create some product and there's high demand for that product, or you create some cure for some disease and there's high demand for that cure, and you make a lot of money doing that. That's fine. You make your money. I'm happy for you. But when you've made that amount of money, Why on earth would the government pay you thousands of dollars to buy an electric vehicle that no one in the middle class can afford even with the subsidy, so that the billionaire making the electric car can sell more of them to wealthy people? That's a little bit of a racket. Salt taxes, state and local deduction. Again, the places that pay the highest state and local taxes tend to be wealthier, higher income areas. So why is it that they get to take off the taxes that they pay their state and municipalities? Why do they get to take that off their federal taxes? It's something that was changed, and now they're talking about bringing it back and allowing, again, these wealthier individuals in these wealthier states to take a larger deduction off their federal tax based on how much they pay for state and local tax. Student loan forgiveness would be another example. Individuals who go to college tend to be from better backgrounds, wealthier backgrounds, higher income backgrounds. Individuals who go to college tend to end up making more money, income, stocking up more wealth over time. So why would we say, and further, those who have the largest student loans tend to be those that are in the most intense programs, like they're getting legal degrees or medical degrees. So why would those who haven't had the benefit of higher education, who aren't going to go into a career as a lawyer or a doctor and make hundreds of thousands of dollars, if not millions, every single year, why would their student loans be subsidized or forgiven and paid for by average taxpayers? And it's not just individuals. The government does it with businesses as well. But again, if a business can go into business and they can make money, then let them go into business and make money. If they make millions and they keep it all for themselves and they give none to charity, well, that's between them and their God. But why would we give? There was a solar company, Solyndra. They were given a loan guarantee of over $500 million by the government. They ultimately filed for bankruptcy. Why? Intel, which was a great company, Intel has been a great American success story. But why, in the Inflation Reduction Act passed just a few years ago, why was Intel granted something like $8.5 billion to build plants? Intel has money. Let Intel build their own plants. If Intel can make money building plants and making chips, semiconductor chips in America, then let them do it. But let Intel and Intel's shareholders pay for that. Why would the American taxpayers pay? The last I read, Intel is now delaying the building of those plants. So what we would want to focus on or redirect some focus. I certainly have no problem with politicians and voters focusing on who's paying taxes and how much taxes are they paying. But that is receiving far too much attention. It's become way too emotional an issue. Those with a biblical worldview would say, always remember, the wealthy and politically connected have, with every government down through history, been able to carve out more for themselves than they quote unquote probably deserved. They've been able to carve out specialties for themselves, loans for themselves, subsidies for themselves, direct payments and benefits for themselves that come at the expense of the less wealthy and the less politically connected. That is what would irritate someone with a biblical worldview. And that is where we would want to focus some real effort and attention in terms of domestic fiscal policy. Thanks so much for listening. Until next time, this is Andy.